Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are having a most delightful evening. I am Joshua Todd Basener, the head of what once the Lewis Society. The Lewis Society has finally had a name change. We are now called the Wardrobe Society. Why are we called the Wardrobe Society? Well, it is a reference to a book by the aforementioned C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It is the most famous book of his Narnia series. The name The Wardrobe Society was chosen to portray the fact that we as a society see literature and art as something you step into and you are consumed by. We see our tradition as something that we don't just look at behind a glass, we experience for ourselves, because we ourselves are very much inheritors philosophically, artistically, and linguistically of the Anglican tradition in the Anglican literature. On that note, if any of you do happen to be interested in joining the Anglican Renaissance, that is, you're an Anglican Christian who's committed to the revival of Orthodox Anglicanism, please don't hesitate. Subscribe to the Anglican Renaissance YouTube channel and go onto the Anglican Renaissance Discord. Despite the fact that we subsist currently largely on Discord and YouTube, it is actually surprisingly a community of people who are very mature and very intellectual. It's run by a lot of ordained clergy and ministers, so very intelligent people. The leader of the Renaissance, Zach, is a good friend of mine. I have nothing but admiration and respect for him, and the people there are just wonderful people. So definitely, it is definitely worth getting in touch with them if you are looking for a solid Anglican Orthodox theological community. On that note, as the head of the Lewis Society, or the head of that, I've already messed myself up. My apologies. As the head of the Wardrobe Society, I'm not cutting that out of the video, by the way, because I like things to be natural and organic and beautiful. As the head of the Wardrobe Society, I thought it impertinent upon myself to continue with my series talking about poetry. Today, though, we're not going to be talking so much about the philosophical presuppositions behind poetry, although I'm sure we'll get into that at some point, because with me, you're always going to get some kind of philosophical presupposition somewhere along the way. Rather, I hope to develop this video for the sake of training you in writing your own poetry more fully and training those literary devices and poetic devices that I've spent some time talking about and considering. If you've not watched previous videos on my discussion of poetry and just kind of the reasons why we write poetry and why it's important to do so, I would admonish you to go back and rewatch those for yourself. If you have, however, I believe you are in a sufficient place now to consider how are we going to start writing poetry using literary devices. My previous video, I opened up the video saying that I wanted to do a short video. 10, 20 minutes was what I was thinking. What I was not thinking was an hour and a half. My previous video was an hour and a half. My current video, I am beginning recording this at 9:30 at night, hence the evening wear. And I I have an agenda today. I have a bit of an agenda. So we will see how well I survive tonight. Worst comes to worst, I have my coffee besides myself. So hopefully, hopefully I will still be awake by the time this video is done. If I nod off to sleep and I spend 8 hours of the video sleeping, that would be embarrassing. If you are looking at the video's length at the moment and you see that it is 8 hours long, it is probably because I spend the predominant majority of that sleeping. If I have spent the predominant majority of the video sleeping, you can feel free to look in the timestamps and skip to where I actually wake up. If I have not spent the predominant majority of the video sleeping, however, then 2 or 3 hours should be sufficient length to cover everything that I wish to cover tonight, Lord willing. All that said, I would like to start with some examples of some literary devices that I've after some time thinking, I think our important kind of first literary devices to grasp. So I was actually, as a little bit of a backstory to this video, I have taken a decent amount of time wondering what literary devices specifically should I talk about today, because there is a wealth of them. I referenced recently, in my first video, I referenced The Elements of Eloquence by Mark Forsyth, which is a book that I quite love, and if you have not read it, I would definitely suggest you're reading it. Forsyth is hilarious, he's a wonderful author, and the book is just delightful. And I was thinking about just going through that book, giving a rough sketch of each literary device, and then I realized that literary devices, yikes, there's a lot of them. So I thought it'd probably be sufficient for me to choose some that I think I find myself using most often, and some that I think are just kind of the basic necessities you need to know as a poet. And start with those, and then with time, I'll probably start thinking of more as I release more videos, and I can put them into other videos or shorts. So right now, this video is kind of summative of about a week's worth of thought on this matter. I'm going to begin my discussion of literary devices with 3 specific literary devices that I think are particularly important, although these are by no means going to be the only ones that I ever talk about. And these literary devices are 1. Metaphor, 2. Juxtaposition, and 3. Repetition. Now you might ask me, Mr. Joshua Todd Basener, why did you choose these 3 literary devices specifically? I will give you 2 reasons. The first one is because I think they're quite nice and I use them quite often. The second one is because I was in a book club with Dr. Gavin Ortland, who had studied church history, and we were doing a study of St. Anselm's Proslogion, which is a wonderful book. And these are 3 literary devices that he decided to highlight during the book club. He highlighted them from St. Anselm, and I will be reading the same St. Anselm passage to you to highlight these literary devices. And during the book club, I decided, you know what, I think this is kind of like the speech of God telling me that I should use these literary devices in my video. So, all credit to Gavin Ortland, and of course to God, but there's always all credit to God. All credit to Gavin Ortland for bringing these literary devices to light for me. By the way, Gavin Ortland is a wonderful, wonderful individual. He's a Baptist pastor, I believe, and he has a PhD from Fuller's Theological Seminary in church history. He's amazingly intelligent, and I would definitely recommend you check out his YouTube channel. I believe it's by the same name, Gavin Ortland. If not that, it's by the name Truth Unites. Is a wonderful individual. But on to our literary devices that I've just previously mentioned that he has highlighted for me. It's probably good for me to run through, before reading the St. Anselm passage to you, to run through a definition before each of these literary devices, before actually going through the passage, so that you know what to look for. The first literary device being metaphor. I believe we all know what a metaphor is when I tell you a figure of speech, something kind of like comparing one thing to another thing, or trying to illustrate something by means of talking about something different. That's a metaphor. I'm using some very vague language here, so I should probably give you an exemplary case. Well, a very good example of a metaphor is a parable. So you read our Lord's parable of the prodigal son. That is a metaphor for redemption. That is a metaphor for the child coming home to the father. And if you have not read our Lord's the parable of the prodigal son, I would definitely recommend you look it up, because it is a very beautiful story. A very good example of metaphor, another good example is C.S. Lewis, the Narnia series, is a whole metaphor. Aslan the lion is a metaphor for Jesus. He is killed and then resurrected, just like Jesus. So that's a perfect example of a metaphor with which you are probably familiar. Another example of metaphor might be The Pilgrim's Progress, if you're aware of that story by John Bunyan. Those are some examples that come to my mind. But I think we all know what a metaphor is. It's just an event that occurs, and or a story that's told for the sake of relating the characters in that story to a different situation, and through that kind of portraying the different situation in a certain light so that the audience can understand the situation more fully. Juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is a fun word. Juxtaposition is something I love using. I use it in my poetry and my prose all the time. In fact, I think I use it pretty much everywhere. Juxtaposition is really just the sharp contrast between two things that's meant to draw out the distinction between the two of them. I use it in my writing. I'll also use it in my music. I'll have a section that's very quiet. It's suddenly a section that's very loud. And that's a simple example of a juxtaposition between quiet and loud, or a section that's really low in the lower registers, and a section that's really high in the higher registers. You'll see this in literature all the time. You could juxtapose between two set of circumstances. I once was happy, now I am sad. You could juxtapose between two moods or ways of talking about something. I was fond of you, you were my friend. Now I despise you, you are my enemy. That's a juxtaposition. In writing, if you have a chapter in a story that's set in a battlefield, and it's chaotic and loud and noisy, and then the next chapter is set in somebody's home, and it's pleasant and peaceful, that's a very good example of a juxtaposition. It draws out the distinction between the two of them, and makes that surface. Repetition, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite. Repetition is keeping the same thing over and over and over again. Repetition actually draws out that which you are repeating. So, a really good example of repetition. Repetition happens all the time in a lot of Hebrew poetry. I have for you a psalm. This is Psalm 136. And notice the repetition here. And I think the repetition will become quite obvious. O give thanks unto the Lord, for he is gracious, and his mercy endureth forever. O give thanks unto the God of all gods, for his mercy endureth forever. O give thanks unto the Lord of all lords, for his mercy endureth forever. Who only doth great wonders, for his mercy endureth forever. Who by his excellent wisdom made the heavens, for his mercy endureth forever. Who laid out the earth above the waters, for his mercy endureth forever. Who hath made great lights, for his mercy endureth forever. The sun to rule the day, for his mercy endureth forever. The moon and the stars to govern the night, for his mercy endureth forever. That's a short section of the psalm. It is much, much longer than that, but I think you already get the gist. The lovely thing about repetition is that you can draw out that one phrase, that ostinato, as we'd call it in music. That is, in this case, for his mercy endureth forever. That is repeated throughout the psalm. And what is both the advantage and the disadvantage of repetition is that when you use it, you'll find that the repeated phrase is probably the thing that you get that draws out the most, that the reader actually walks away with. The other things you probably don't end up remembering. If you were to read through that whole psalm, chances are you won't remember anything besides for his mercy endureth forever. And quite frankly, when it comes to the statement for his mercy endureth forever, I don't know about other people, but I quite think that that is a good thing to remember. But that is also just, in general, that's something worth considering when you use repetition, to be careful that it doesn't become the case that the reader only hears the one phrase, the sacrifice of any meaning that you would have intended the other phrases to have. That's my caution when it comes to repetition. But as you will find in the St. Anselm passage, repetition, juxtaposition, and metaphor, they all work together quite nicely. And I actually really quite like his repetition of juxtaposition, his repetition of juxtaposing two things. You're going to see that in just a moment, because I'm just about to read it, finally. And the way these work together, it helps give a variation to the repetition, because sometimes repetition can start to become pretty dull and pretty maddening. If there's ever a possibility that you could be maddened or dullened by the phrase for his mercy endureth forever, then by the time you finish reading that psalm, you most certainly are going to be. I don't think you could rightly be. I think if you are, you have not quite rightly grasped the beauty of those words. But if it's at all possible for you to be so, then yes, you are going to get sick of hearing "for his mercy endureth forever." Again, quite frankly, if you are sick of those words, that is your problem, because those are wonderful words. But by all means, when it comes to repetition, sometimes repetition can drive you a little insane. What you'll find with the St. Anselm passage, hopefully, though, is that the way that he juxtaposits, I'm going to use that as the verb form now. That is the verb form I officially henceforth declare. That is the verb form. I'm a poet. I can make up my own words. The way that he juxtaposits two contrary phrases and then repeats them, you'll find actually adds a kind of a certain flavor to his repetition that keeps it from becoming maddening. So, if I can open up to the right page, here we are. This is St. Anselm, Proslogion, chapter 1, and he's beginning this conversation about the state of humanity on his own without God. How wretched human beings are! They have lost the very thing for which they are created. Hard and terrible was their fall. Alas! Think what they have lost and what they have found. Think what they have left behind and what they have kept. They have lost the happiness for which they were created and found an unhappiness for which they were not created. They have left behind the only source of happiness and kept which brings nothing but misery. Once human beings ate the bread of angels for which they now hunger. Now they eat the bread of sorrows, which once they did not know. Alas for the common lamentation of human beings, the universal outcry of the children of Adam. He was satisfied to the full, we sigh with hunger. He had everything he needed, we go begging. He happily possessed those things and abounded them in misery. He happily possessed those things and abandoned them in misery. We unhappily do without them, and miserably desire them, but alas, we remain empty-handed. Why did he not so preserve for us as he could easily have done what we so woefully lack? Why did he thus shut us out from the light and cover us with darkness? Why did he take away our life and inflict death upon us? What wretches we are! Think whence we have been cast out, whither we have been thrown. Thrown down from so great a height and buried so deep, from our homeland into exile, from the vision of God into our blindness, from the joy of immortality into the bitterness and terror of death. What a wretched change, from such great good into such great evil. Oh, woeful loss, woeful sorrow, all is woeful. I think it should be very clear to you where the power of those words is derived. The repetition, the constant, once we eat the breads of angels for which they now hunger, now they eat the bread of sorrows, that constant hammering. It feels like you're hammering. It feels like the waves are coming constantly on you. This throwing down upon accusation of all the terrible sufferings of humanity, and the sufferings which are brought out through juxtaposition. Once we were happy, now we are miserable. It really gives a power to those words. If you're ever looking in your own poetry to draw out and really harp on a certain idea, I think this sort of structure of a repetition, or particularly in this case, a repetition of juxtaposition, can really help give that sense that something is being hammered in and give a certain power to your idea. What Anselm could have said was, we're really, 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 really miserable. And that would have been a subpar way of describing his situation. Why would it have been a subpar way of describing his situation is because adding more reallys does not make your thing more interesting. What makes your thing more interesting is going on this lengthy poetic rant about the miserable state of humankind and taking endless pains to juxtaposit. There's that verb form again that I don't seem to be able to escape. Juxtaposit two sets of circumstance. Now, when it comes to the metaphor in this passage, It's a little less common than the constant repetition or the juxtaposition, but you did hear it here. Once human beings ate the bread of angels, for which they now hunger. Now they eat the bread of sorrows. Eating bread is a metaphor for nourishment, just kind of more general nourishment. These are actually references to Scripture. Eat the bread of angels, that is a reference to Psalm 78, and eating the bread of sorrows is a reference to Psalm 127. So what Anselm is doing here, not only is he hearkening back to Scripture, which is it's a form of literary reference, really. Literary reference is a poetic device that I would encourage you to use. He's also using the literature in the kind of metaphorical sense in which it was originally written. Obviously, he doesn't think that humans actually sat with angels literally and had bread with them, although I'm sure maybe they did, and that was nice. But that's not the real misery of the situation. The real misery of the situation is what that's metaphorical for, which is that once humans had union with God, closeness with God, now since the fall of man, which is that tragic event where Adam, our representative, sinned, and through us, through him have we sinned. Now that has occurred, we now eat the bread of sorrows, which is to say, we go about laboring and sowing, but what for? Very powerful thoughts here that St. Anselm is communicating, and he's able to communicate them through his poetry. He's very intentional with his words. Dr. Ortland points out that this was prior to the invention of the printing press, so each and every word was precious to him. He certainly spent much time scrupling over his very specific word choice, his very specific word usage. So it's very reasonable for us to look through his words and to consider things very closely. It's much like poetry. In poetry, the poets spend much time, endless time, scrupling over every single word to pack as much meaning into the poem as possible. Now, in that matter, moving somewhat on from St. Anselm, I would like to talk more generally about the idea of meaning in poetry. Metaphor is a powerful means of drawing out the meaning of something. When you have a metaphor for the story of Christ's death and resurrection through, say, Aslan, it's very clear what you're doing. Metaphor is powerful. Metaphor is also very easy. It's pretty easy for us to come up with metaphors for things. Fables are also a very famous example of a metaphor. You could talk about the fable of the tortoise and the hare, and how the hare got cocky and took a nap by a tree, and the tortoise won the race because it was slow and steady. And that's a metaphor for the general idea of slow and steady wins the race. And these are very, they're very easy to do. They're very straightforward, and it's kind of obvious. There's kind of like a 1-1 ratio a lot of times with metaphors. Sometimes they can run the risk of being a little heavy-handed. In fact, if you know a little bit of your history of the relationship between C.S. Lewis and his friend J.R.R. Tolkien, and yes, they were friends, not terribly close friends, particularly near close to the end of their lives, but they were friends, they knew each other. You'll know that one of the points of disagreement between Lewis and Tolkien regarding their fantasy literature was the idea of metaphor. So with Lewis, he wrote the Narnia series, and it was very intensely metaphorical for Jesus. Tolkien, though, wrote The Lord of the Rings, which is a masterwork of fiction. I'm actually reading it now, and I'm quite loving it. But what's kind of a stark difference between the two of them is that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is pretty clearly not a metaphor for the Bible or for Jesus or for the death and resurrection. And that's because Tolkien thought that metaphors were just generally too heavy-handed in literature. So he thought about just writing a good story, whereas Lewis wanted to write a specific metaphor. If I'm not mistaken, I think Lewis might have thought that the Narnia series was a little too heavy-handed, so he might have been a little self-critical, but I'm really not sure. I can't exactly remember now, honestly. Could be wrong about that, so don't take my word for it. That is sometimes a little bit, unfortunately, though, the issue that people can take with metaphors is that they can be too heavy-handed. That can be good for you. Sometimes it's not ideal, though. There are other ways of giving your poetry meaning, though, particularly when it comes to poetry. The wonderful thing about poetry is that poetry has this kind of quality to it where one poem can be applied to many different circumstances. And I think this is actually one of the reasons that our modern society has so much trouble with poetry sometimes, is because our modern society is very analytical and scientific. So we like our one-one comparisons. We like to be able to come to a story and see only one thing that the story is trying to tell us, very obviously, with a moral and everything, and not having to draw comparisons between everything else in the story. So sometimes when we come to poetry, we're very bad at analyzing poetry because we want to say that the poet is trying to say just one thing about one event that happened in his life, when in actuality, the poet might be commenting on something more general than just that. I would like to show you some examples. Call me a narcissist, but I will be reading to you a lot of my own poetry today. And if you have any problems with me reading to you my own poetry, I'm kind of baffled that you came to me, because I'm the one who wrote it, so if you don't want to hear it, you probably shouldn't be coming to me. I will read you some of my nature poetry. And what I find about my nature poetry is that it's probably the poetry where you'll find things don't seem to be one-to-one metaphorical to one event in life. If I can find it here, one of my more solemn poems. This is a poem that I wrote, I believe it was April of 2023. 2024? 24. No, I was wrong. It was 2023. Wow. I'm bad at knowing my life. That hurts. I may have an existential crisis later. This is April 2023. And is an elegy to a dead deer. And I would like you to listen to this poem and think. Try and firstly think, if I were to try and draw a 1-1 situation with the deer and something in real life, what would I draw a comparison to? And then think, what else could this deer represent, and what else could this poem be trying to say? This is the poem, Elegy to a Dead Deer, written Saturday, April 27th, 2023. O twisted corpse of far too young a deer, forgotten in this forest shielded field, when for no reason death had forced thy yield, as none thy pleas would nature care to hear. Shall I remiss on how thy corpse decayed, or how thy gut was carved out from thy ribs, or how thy skin from bone was torn and ripped, or how flies saw thy eyes devoured away? I watched thee all decay each day by day. And friend, oh dear friend, if only I could still see thee frolic through these woods, I'd give my life that thou may leap away. Now will the creeks near trickle mourn thy hair? Or will the willows grow up weeping here? And will the doves alight to share my tears, where only vultures land for flesh to tear? If this be how nature doth treat her past, by tearing flesh to feed the not yet dead, nearing the graveside only to be fed, then her rule is the worst to ever be passed. Now tell me not that this is worth no tear. Silence such stupid lies from which you say, such lies that I need not mourn nature's ways, for it is our own nature which killed this deer. Nature alone has forgot far too young a deer. Looking through this poem, what may strike you is that you yourself have probably experienced misery, grief, frustration that is understood through these words. But the experiences I had, which inspired these words, are not your experiences. What I was struggling with when I came across a dead deer and was inspired to write this might be very different from what you were struggling with. But that's the wonder to poetry, isn't it? That poet can beget something which speaks to more than just one situation, which is summative of many things. This deer who died is not a metaphorical symbolism for just one person in life, or just one thing that occurred to me, although might have been inspired by a specific person or a specific thing. This deer could be symbolic of your family member who passed away, your friend who moved away. It could be symbolic of a divorce, a passing, something gone. But you notice that there are still definitive claims made about the situation. There's a definitive claim made about the idea of nature, and the idea of what is natural is not always what is good. That is what this poem is trying to say. I would make a caveat that what is natural is not always good in a broken world like ours. That's sort of the point of this poem, is that to be laid back and cynical or laid back and stoic about the natural way of things is, according to this poem, not what we are made for. It's not beautiful, it's not true, it's not good. In fact, it can be quite disgusting and monstrous. And that is a principle that applies to many different situations, doesn't it? It's not something you can point at just one idea. I have a lot of poems that are like that, particularly my nature poetry. Often tends to talk about ideas which are more abstract, but puts them into the form of natural objects. I have another poem here with me today. This is a shorter poem, and it's a poem dedicated to a magnolia that I saw in blossom April of last year. And I will also give you this forewarning here, is that I did not bookmark any of these poems, so I will have to take a moment flipping through to find them. So every time I need to find them, I need to come up with some way of stalling you before I find it, so that you don't get bored and have to just watch me sit here in a chair looking through my leather-bound book trying to find a page, which I am currently doing and currently failing at. Was it April of last year? Might have been May of last year, perhaps even March. I don't know. I'm really failing at this. Was it after Easter or before Easter? Let me see. What I'd like you to listen to as you read this nature poem is try and think again. What is this? Is this magnolia trying to symbolize something? And what you'll find is the answer to the question is yes. But the answer to the question is not yes, it is trying to symbolize XYZ as opposed to everything else. What you'll find is it's actually a more broad, more abstract meaning behind this poem. Oh, I believe it's right here. Ode to the Pink Magnolia. Yes? I wrote this actually while sitting in this very spot right here. You can't see it right now because currently the whole world is covered in a veil of blackness and obscurity. But just out this window, there's actually a magnolia tree that is in bloom around the time that this poem was writing. And yes, it is in April. And it is a gorgeous thing to see from my window. As a little bit of background here, I mentioned the magnolia as, I believe I mentioned as sister in April's rain or something along those lines. I was born in April, actually. My birthday is on the 18th of April, so When I refer to things that bloom in April, that's often the way of referring to them is as a sibling in April. This is the Ode to the Pink Magnolia, written April 4th, 2025. The wind strums on thy blooming pink harp strings, that fragrant petals paint their harmonies. Each one a note and melody now sings, once more as spring breaks forth and winter flees. O darling sister, under April's care, to see thy joyful blooms held out to me, I fancy is well worth September's glare, and makes me proud to share this month with thee. And while the winds by which thy branches sing let pass away their precious girlish glow, I know in heart thy song outlives the spring, so long as beauty's streams eternal flow. So with this truth in heart, I'll bear life long, and vow this spring-born life to join thy song. And you might be able to call that poem a form of metaphor, but it's even then, it's trying to, it's not really metaphorical of a one-to-one ratio between the idea of the magnolia and the idea of, say, beauty, or specifically the idea of harmony. It's very summative. Magnolia is representative of this greater idea of harmony, this greater idea of blossoming. There's this temporality to the nature of the magnolia. The magnolia passes away soon, but the beauty remains forever, is kind of the point of the poem. And you can definitely draw out that meaning. It isn't so much of a metaphor, though. It's more of a using one object to say something very important about very abstract ideas. The way I might say this is that poetry reaches into the stars and brings them down to distribute among the people in the form of pearls. We take things that are distant and abstract and make them understandable for people, and that's what we do with these kinds of poems that are abstract, talking about something abstract and applicable to many different situations, but talking about them almost filtered through the means of something like some natural phenomenon like a magnolia tree or a past deer. Sometimes a complaint you'll hear about poetry is that poetry is too abstract. People say that you're being too poetic and too abstract, and they think of that as a bad thing. And I think this just comes from actually an unfortunate way of understanding poetry. Poetry is not too abstract. The point of poetry is to take the abstract and marry it sacramentally with something understandable, something that we know. And that can be done through metaphor. It can be done through this talking about magnolia trees or dead deers as a representation of the idea of harmony, or the idea of mortality, or the idea of nature. Poetry does not keep things in a world of abstraction where they can never be reached by us. Neither does it leave things all in a world of the immediately understandable and the immediately graspable, where everything appeals simply to our own palate and nothing challenges us to go beyond ourselves or to think beyond ourselves. Poetry is, as I said in a previous video, sacramental. It is a marriage of the distant and the divine with the physical and the normal. So that's one way that can be done, is by packing a lot of meaning and a lot of different applications into one poem or one idea translated through a poem. You can do so much with the meaning of a poem, though. It doesn't just have to be that. One of my favorite things to do when it comes to meanings in poems is to do what's called a double meaning or ambiguity. I wrote this hymn a while back, last December, and this hymn you'll see is a little bit more specific. It's not a broad, like something abstract and applicable to many different situations, made definable to one situation. It's very specifically, well, it's obviously about Jesus. It's a hymn. But what you will find with this hymn, if I can actually find it for you, my word, April. Wow, I'm losing track of my own life. What you'll find with this hymn is that, well, it's talking specifically about one person. It's saying, it has what's called a double meaning in some of its lines. And it means to be, it's hearkening to one form of imagery in one line, or in one line, in hearkening to a certain imagery, is also kind of hacking meaning behind that imagery, which perhaps upon a second reading will become clear. If I can find it, which, once again, I have not bookmarked this sufficiently, so it might take me a moment. If I can find it, I can read it for you, and you can actually see that. Here we are. This is a poem that I wrote December 3rd of 2025, and I will read to you the first stanza, the first verse, because this is the one where you really see that double meaning coming out, and I would like you to think, who's this poem about? I think it should be quite obvious. I think I've already spoiled it, actually. Think, who is this poem about? But also think, what is it saying about him? You might be surprised to find that with each line, there are different things that you realize it could be saying about him. So this is a poem. This is the hymn, O Come Thou Prince from Heaven Ride. O come thou Prince from Heaven Ride, O come thou Joshua of old, take thee a blade upon thy side, who pierced where guilt has taken hold. O take a crown upon thy head, O take the steel within thy hand, our one defense against earth dread, come plant thy sword into these lands. A word of peace and joy, let us rejoice to wait. What's the answer to that first question? Whom is this poem talking about? Well, obviously, it is talking about Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, born of a virgin, come from heaven to ride down and save from sins. There's one line, O come thou Joshua of old. The name Joshua, actually in the original Hebrew, is Yeshua, which is the same name for Jesus in the original Hebrew. The name for Jesus in the original Hebrew is Yeshua. So, my name being Joshua Todd Basener originally translates back to Jesus, which is pretty cool. But I did not just insert my name into the poem. Just for the record, that wasn't just me throwing myself into there. That this is talking about Jesus. This is harkening back to biblical imagery. I will be honest with you. I think it's honestly pretty neat that I have a name that translates back to Jesus, but I don't think that gives me any right to gloat. I just think that's pretty cool. That aside, it's obvious the poem is talking about Jesus. What's it saying about Jesus? What you may think immediately when you hear the poem, O come thou Prince from Heaven Ride, O come thou Joshua of old, you're thinking of a warrior. Especially considering who Joshua was in the Old Testament. If you're aware of the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, it is the book of the conquest of Canaan. Joshua was a commander, he was a warrior, he was a soldier, he was a general. So the imagery here is very warlike. Take thee a blade upon thy side, to pierce where guilt has taken hold. That seems to be implying Christ charging down from heaven and piercing where guilt has taken hold. That's attacking the strongholds of the enemy. Seems to hint at Christus Victor atonement theory almost. But maybe read it a few more times. Consider it a little more closely. O come thou prince from heaven ride. Prince. Where else in Scripture does the word prince appear? What prophecies are there about Jesus being prince? Well, if you look into the Old Testament, I believe it's the book of Isaiah. We might know this from Handel's oratorio, the Messiah. He should be called Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace. Prince of Peace. O come thou prince from heaven ride. What is Christ the prince of? He is the Prince of Peace. How does peace relate to being a warrior? I don't know. Let's read on. O come thou Joshua of old. Again, hearkening back to the warlike imagery. So you're thinking, this is a warrior. Why are we asking about peace? Take thee a blade upon thy side. Take thee a blade upon thy side. So immediately what you're thinking of is a sword at your side. Such as this one. Put in the scabbard upon thy side. You're going out into battle. You're preparing for war. But consider perhaps the story of Jesus. Jesus did not go into war. He did not take a sword on his side. In fact, he was quite adamantly against taking a sword at his side. He told his disciples, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my disciples would fight for me. That's what he says to Pontius Pilate during his trial before his crucifixion. What actually happened to Jesus? Jesus went as a lamb to slaughter. He went to be killed. He did not go to kill. What does take a blade upon thy side hearken to? If you know the story of the crucifixion, you know that after they determined that Jesus had died on the cross, instead of breaking his legs as they usually do to crucifixion victims, they assured that he was dead by piercing his side. So the line, take a blade upon thy side, has one meaning in being military imagery. It's the imagery of Christ as a warrior. But it has another subtle meaning in being sacrificial imagery. It's the imagery of Christ as he who was pierced for our transgressions. To pierce where guilt has taken hold. This is really interesting. This harkens to the idea of penal substitution, that Christ is a substitute for our own maliciousness and our own evil, that when he was killed upon the cross, it's very similar to the sacrificial system of the ancient Israel. When he was killed upon the cross, he became a propitiation for sin once and for all. That is to say, all of guilt was laid on him. Where is it that guilt was taken hold? It was on Christ, the man crucified. What is the spear piercing? The spear is piercing where guilt has taken hold. The blade upon thy side is piercing Christ. O take a crown upon thy head. This is more double meaning. You think of kingly imagery, you think of the imagery of a conqueror. But if you are familiar with the crucifixion story, you are aware that during his crucifixion, to mock him for claiming to be the king of the Jews, the Roman guard formed a crown made out of thorns and placed it on our Lord's head. Our one defense against earth's dread. You would ask a Christian, why is it that Jesus is our defense against earth's dread? How do we know that? Because he was killed for us. It isn't because he came riding down with a sword on a white horse, although Revelation promises he will. It is because he came in humility to die as the first of the once and for all sacrifice for all sin. Come plant thy sword into these lands. Now that's really interesting imagery there, because of course you might be thinking again of warrior imagery, of charging down and planting your sword into the enemy. But think about that for just a moment. Two comments I may make here. Firstly, planting a sword into the ground. If you were planting a sword into the ground, what are you doing? You're declaring. You might be declaring victory, but you're certainly declaring an end of conflict. Because if you're planting the sword into the ground, it's no longer facing your enemy, so your enemy has been defeated. So that line isn't necessarily just a line hearkening to warfare imagery, it's a line hearkening to the idea of being victorious. It's a line saying, come be victorious. But here's another question for you I would like to ask. What shape does a sword make when it is planted into the ground? We often probably think of this classic medieval two-handed sword, which you see on the ground beside me. Does this shape happen to remind you of something? I'll give you a hint. It's also behind me. That is a shape of a cross. So plant thy sword into the ground is to say, come to the cross. So this poem serves almost a double meaning, and it's kind of an example of, frankly, a little bit of a cruel double meaning, because it's a double meaning regarding victory and triumph in a warlike sense, but the second meaning is one of sacrifice. And if you wanted to go into the nitty-gritty theology of this, I think this could actually be an interesting point of discussion about atonement theories. If you're familiar with atonement theories, Christus Victor versus another one of my favorite atonement theories, which is penal substitutionary atonement, and how those two can be understood together with each other through this poem. Because in reality, something like the atonement is very multifaceted and is very there's a very poetic element to it, and that there's a lot that it could mean. It's very summative. So if you that's a comment if you know what an atonement theory is, which I don't expect all my viewers to be so much a nerd about atonement theories, but if you do, that is definitely a rabbit trail to go down. There's one more way you can use meaning. So up until now, we've talked about meanings as something that's summative. It could be one abstract idea that's applied to many different circumstances. We've talked about meanings that are double. It could be one phrase that means two things that can be applied two different ways. I would also like to talk about meanings that are ironic. And for this, I will turn to another one of my poems. You often hear talk about poetic irony, and how this kind of plays into the idea of double meaning. And so this is very much of a very similar thing to double meaning in poetry. Poetic irony is when you kind of, essentially, it's when you say something that appears to have a good meaning or good mood towards something, but then you read on or you consider it in context, and it's ironic. It's really kind of contradictory to the certain mood that you're striking when you consider the real meaning of the word. So I would like to read to you, I believe this is a sonnet that I wrote a while back, October of 2 years ago. 2 years ago? October 17th, 2024, I believe. So that would be 1 year ago, roughly. This poem is entitled When All Is Said and Done. And as you listen to the way that the words are ironic. They have a double meaning to them. The first meaning you hear is something more favorable, something that sounds rather nice. But then as the poem continues, you realize that what it's talking about is actually something quite unfavorable and quite not nice. When all is said and done, we will find rest. We can find peace that after life's long while, we will at last be free to sleep our best. Each man and woman will forever smile, When all our weary earthly trials have passed, we'll have a cozy velvet bed to love, to grin at earthly mortal fools at last. We'll be cut off from those who slave above. Rome's greatest masons slaved and strived each day, and of their work's reward we have no lack. But yet, no work will outlast those displays, from which great Roman skulls at us grin back. For just as time slips off our palms like grains of sand, so too will flesh one day slip off from our old hands. Did you notice the turn the poem took? If you've listened to my video on voltas, you might notice that the turn kind of happens during the volta, actually, after line 8. That suddenly, out of nowhere, you realize we're talking about death. The poem opens up talking about how we will find rest, we can find peace, that after life's one while, we will at last be free to sleep our best. Each man and woman will forever smile. What's forever smiling hearkening back to? It's hearkening back to a skull. Skulls have no skin around their mouth, they are just a skull, so they are smiling. And they are resting, because they have no life. When all our weary earthly trials have passed, we'll have a cozy velvet bed to love. Velvet bed, of course, being a coffin. To grin at earthly mortal fools at last. The implication here is that we are no longer earthly mortal fools, probably because we're dead. We'll be cut off from those who slave above. What does it mean, slave above? Why are they above? Well, obviously the answer to that question is because we, that the poem is talking about, are below. What is below? The ground. What do we put in the ground? Coffins. Rome's greatest masons slaved and strived each day. Why are we talking about Rome? What does Rome do? And of their work's reward we have no lack. Okay, yeah, sure, we have no lack. And yet, one work will outlast those displays, from which great Roman skulls at us grin back. There we are. We're talking about skulls. And it harkens back to the original imagery of each man and woman will forever smile. Great Roman skulls grin back. It's talking about the idea of smiling. The skulls are smiling. The skulls are forever resting. This is the poetic irony here. This is the double meaning. The second meaning behind all this idea of forever resting is that you forever rest because there is no life in you, in your mortal bodies. This is definitely one of the darker poems. I acknowledge today that I'm taking you something of a whiplash of moods between the dead deer and the happy magnolia and the triumph of our Lord and Savior and then dying in the grave. I hope that you remember through all of this that out of all of these poems, the idea to take away is that that beauty which you see in the pink magnolia, which you see killed by the deer, was also killed in Christ and resurrected in him. I'll come back to that idea later at the end of the video, I hope. But if I don't end up sleeping for 8 hours of this video. Those are kind of, all that considered, this idea that poetry can be something summative, taking the stars and dishing them out among mortal people as pearls. It is something that takes that which is infinite, which is grand, and brings it in finite ways, but applicable ways, ways that are applicable in many different circumstances. Poetry can have double meanings. You can be talking about one thing very specifically, but in talking about that one thing very specifically, the words you are using have this subtle second meaning to them, which in many cases can be ironic. The subtle second meaning can be something that actually ends up being rather disfavorable to your original meaning. Originally, your mood or your meaning might have seemed very happy, but then when you consider the double meaning, it's actually much darker. Now that I've talked about this, I would like to go on a little bit of a discussion about structure. Structure, or shall I talk about that? There are two things that I would like to talk about tonight before we wrap up here. I would like to talk a little bit about structure, and then I would also like to talk about the idea of metonymy, synodoky, and simile. I think what I will do, before I move on to structure, is I'll talk about metonymy, synodoky, and simile. And perhaps these will be a short tangent. Metonymy, synodoky, and simile, those might be words with which you are familiar, they may not be. Maybe you're familiar with one, maybe you're familiar with none. That rhymes, by the way, that's a rhyme. I could put that into a poem. How delightful. Metonymy. What is metonymy? And this is, I will go on this tangent because I think these three terms can be really helpful to you in writing your own poetry. They're helpful for the sake of writing poetry that actually means something. So, as I said before, sometimes bad poetry can be way too just showing you the stars and not trying to dish them out as pearls, so to speak, to borrow my analogy from earlier. Bad poetry often ends up just being very abstract and not actually saying anything. We can find plenty of examples of bad love songs that talk about how you are all I long for, you are all I worship and adore. If I have just offended you in your taste for jazz music, I will have you know that I do actually really like the song Fly Me to the Moon. I just think the lyrics are a little, as some might say, cringy sometimes, but that's another question. Bad poetry can sometimes be very way too abstract in just saying things like that, like I worship you, I adore you. Okay, great. What does that mean? Or it could talk about sometimes there are some. I'll try and avoid offending artistic tastes. By the way, if I say something that does offend your artistic tastes, please know that I don't mean offense against you. I know different people have different experiences with different forms of art, and that's. I don't want to offend the fact that you can have genuinely valuable experiences with art that I consider to be subpar, and that can be beautiful. I've met some wonderful people who have artistic disagreements with me, so please don't take personal offense in my talking about these topics. But I will note that there are some subpar worship songs that we might find among contemporary Christian artists, and I don't want to just sit here bashing all contemporary Christian artists. There are quite a few that I quite like and I think have very good music, but sometimes I think they try and borrow certain poetic or hymnotic or biblical cliches, talking about God, you are holy, you are good. And these are phrases which are true, but they don't really go into much detail about what those things mean. It's very much about like a love song which talks about, my dear, you are beautiful, you are wonderful. That's great, those are true, but what do they mean? If you don't go into what those mean, or you don't give solid examples, or you don't tie us into solid imagery, those phrases can really just fall flat. So when it comes to good poetry, you want to find ways of tying things into solid imagery. And to do so, I would commend to you metonymy, synodoky, and simile. Just a few examples. To go through, I probably won't give you specific examples from my poetry, but I'm sure you can find them. In fact, from the few poems that I've just read, I may challenge you to go through and perhaps go through some of my shorts. I have a few shorts about reading poetry. And just try and find examples of these things. Or find poetry for your own that you find examples for these things. Metonymy. Firstly, metonymy. Metonymy is when you use a certain I don't want to say apart for whole because that's more synodoky, but when you use a certain kind of like a certain name for a whole agent or a whole thing that is kind of like if taken literally is associated with the thing. If taken literally would be very weird to say. So maybe it'd be better for me to give you an example of metonymy because I guess it's late and my ability to define what metonymy is starting to abandon me. I'm much better at definitions when it's not 11 o'clock at night. I don't have to work tomorrow, fortunately, so I can stay up as late as I want, drinking coffee and talking about poetry. But an example of metonymy with which we're probably quite familiar with is when we use the name of an institution to refer to those individuals within the institution who make decisions. So as an American, I often hear on the news when talking about our president, the news will talk about the White House. So the White House has decided XYZ, is to say the president or somebody in the president's cabinet has decided XYZ. We can say the White House has decided this. If you are one of my friends from across the pond, you might hear them talking about the Parliament or the Crown has decided this. The Crown has decided to raise a defense against the Spanish Armada. The Crown has decided to affirm the 39 Articles of the Church of England. You'll hear those kinds of languages within these ecclesiastical circles. You might hear people talking about the papacy has decided this, the Pope has decided this or that. It might be summative of saying that like I suppose it's less of a good example because the Pope is the one who decides things, but saying the Vatican has decided something is a substitute for saying that the Pope has decided something. The Vatican has decided to affirm the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas could be synonymous with saying that the Pope has decided to affirm that, or certain councils decided to affirm that, such as the Council of Trent. But we might just say the Vatican as summative of that. Another wonderful example of synodoky or metonymy that you can find in popular culture is the Senate shall decide your fate, and the response to that being, I am the Senate. It would be kind of weird to consider that, like, what is the Senate? How is the Senate deciding your fate? Well, the Senate is the people within the Senate, so the people within the Senate will decide your fate. That would actually be more accurate, but we can say the Senate will decide your fate is essentially summative of that. But more obviously metonymy is to say, I am the Senate. He's not literally saying that he's all the people in the Senate. That's not an accurate response. This is Emperor Palpatine, by the way. What he's saying is, I have all the power over the Senate. It'd be similar to the president saying, I am the White House. It would be rather strange, and I'm frankly would be under the impression that we would probably need to get the president's mental cognition checked if he actually thought that he was a bunch of brick and glass and concrete on Pennsylvania Avenue. But if the president says, I am the White House, that's not what he means by that. What he means by that is, I have all the power over the presidential authority. And saying, I am the White House is a form of metonymy to show that. Synodoky is... that one is... Well, that's one I can define, actually. That one is when you refer to, as we say, the part for the whole. So synodoky would be talking about one instantiation or part of thing and using that as kind of like a whole representation of it. So I have an example right here on my shelf, actually, that I harkened back to at the beginning of this video. And this is the example of coffee. What I have in my hand is my coffee. I quite like coffee, actually. I work as a barista. And if you are aware that I said that it's 11 o'clock at night, you might actually be quite baffled that I'm drinking coffee. Firstly, I don't think it's actually 11 o'clock. I hope not. But more importantly, yeah, I do drink coffee rather late. Uh, but when I say I'm holding my coffee, that is actually me speaking metonymously. If I wanted to be extremely accurate, I would tell you that I am holding a cup, a saucer, and coffee. That would be more accurate. But if I were to speak in terms of metonymy, I would say coffee, and coffee being a part of that trio is summative for the whole. You can use metonymy in poetry when referring to, say, I guess you can use both of these in poetry. So if I'm talking about natural forces, for instance, I can talk about the clouds bringing this or that about. That could be metonymous for just kind of the general forces of nature. Uh, or I guess it would be synodocus. Is that a word now? Synodocus? I'm making up words left and right tonight, aren't I? Something that would be a form of metonymy in poetry would be probably talking about nature deciding this or that, although that might be also more of a form of personification. I don't have a specific example off the top of my head. I'm sure you can find some, but as a perfect example is that idea of the White House deciding something. You could say, you could talk about metonymy as as in terms of like, instead of saying that society is doing something, if you're writing a poem that's a societal critique, you could talk about the people have done something. The people have turned some direction. So instead of having to say like every individual person or something, you could say that America has done something. That could be a form of metonymy, depending on what your subject is talking about. I think, as you've probably been able to understand from my inability to define metonymy perfectly and my inability to offer good examples for metonymy, I actually quite prefer synodoky. I tend to use that more often. So I'll talk about synodoky if I'm talking about like period of my life where I struggled. Instead of saying that period of life, which would be a whole, I talk about nights of endless prayer. Nights of endless prayer are a part of that period of life. Um, but for my purposes, it would be unimportant for me to talk about a period of life where I struggled, because that wouldn't really hit the reader quite the same way as talking about nights of endless prayer. Um, that would hit the reader. So if I say I waded through nights of endless prayer, that has a different effect to it than saying I waded through 3 months that were hard. And the reason that has a different effect of it is really because that's giving you a very specific um, thing to think about, to grasp on, very specific imagery. And that's what makes for good poetry as opposed to bad poetry. Bad poets will tell you I waited for 3 months. And it's uninteresting because, I don't know, they could be happy 3 months. That's not enough information for you. But if I were to tell you, as a good poet, that I waited through nights of endless prayer or months of endless prayer or whatever, um, that is something much more substantial to grasp onto. It may be the case that these nights of endless prayer is not the whole of my suffering. Maybe I also suffered through days of endless prayer as well, or through days of melancholy sighing or something like that. And take whatever you will. But the important part, to my purposes, is talking about nights of endless prayer, because that gives you something to hold on to, and that's kind of like, maybe that could be the pinnacle of my suffering. So where this culminates in advice for poets is, if you feel like your poetry doesn't have enough meaning to it, try and think about certain things to grasp onto. So, for instance, if you're talking about a time that you were in love, don't talk about a time that you were in love just in those words. Don't write in your poem, remember back to that time we were in love. Write in your poem, Remember back to that field we used to walk together. Remember back to that tree we played below. Remember back to that conversation we had. That is synodoky. That is the part and substitute for the whole being the time that we were in love, and the part being the tree we played below, the sunset we watched, the conversation we had. And that will make things much more, that gives your reader something to grasp onto. That gives your reader an emotional weight to the thing. Because the reader is going to understand that there's a part for a whole. So the reader may actually have kind of like the mental capacities to grasp that there's more than just this tree that we played below. But this tree we played below is also significant, and that comes out to the reader too. You give more significance to the reader, and you essentially actually say the same thing as you would have said if you were to say, remember back to that time we were in love. But you give more substantial representation of what that means, and the reader can understand that, and that makes that passage much more meaningful to the reader. So if you are rereading your poetry and you find it being a little too abstract and a little too hard to grasp, I would recommend looking through and wondering what parts of this are important to me that I can use to represent the whole. What parts of this romance were important to me that I can use to represent the whole? What parts of this struggle are important to me that I can use to represent the whole? What parts of this imagery, of this image that I saw, this painting that I saw, that I could use to represent the whole? That's where your poem will gain a lot more meaning. When we read through funeral elegies, we don't hear the funeral elegy, at least if it's a well-written elegy. We don't hear it talking about, I guess the word is funeral eulogies, but if it's a poem, it's an elegy. We don't hear it talking about how good of a person you were, or how great of a person this was. We hear them talking about specific things, like, this person once helped me with this. This person once stayed by my bed when I was sick. That's because synodoky is a lot more emotionally impactful for people when it comes to talking about a whole that is important. Before moving on, I would also just like to make a quick note about simile. Simile is, we use it all the time. Simile is, it's quite like bread and butter for us. Simile is like, for me, it's like tea. I have it all the time. Simile is like an evening breeze. It's very wonderful. If you have not already determined, I've been using simile for the past 3 sentences that I've spoken. Simile is very simple. It is just saying something is like something. You've probably heard it in the poems that I've written somewhere, although I don't happen to remember a specific example. But a good example of simile from Scripture is, like as the deer panteth for the water, so longeth my soul for thee. That is a simile. It is a saying, this is like this. My soul longs for God, like the deer panting for the water. The deer longs for the water. And apparently I long for water too, because I've just been drinking coffee and talking for about an hour. So I guess, like as the Joshua Todd panteth for the water brooks, so longeth my soul for thee, may also be a good form of rendering that poem right now. But simile is wonderfully helpful for poetry. What I think is nice about simile and important about simile is that when you use it, you're saying one thing is like something else. A is like B, and that A has a certain attribute of B that you're trying to exemplify, but there are also other attributes of A that could be carried over to B that you are kind of implying. So if a man tells a woman that her eyes are green like emeralds, she is going to be flattered. Why is she going to be flattered by him telling her eyes are green? It's because her eyes are green like emeralds. That implies not only that her eyes are green, but also that her eyes are valuable, or that she's valuable or beautiful, because emeralds are valuable and beautiful. Now, if a man were to tell a lady that her eyes are green like peat moss, she would be rather confused, and he might end up getting slapped. I think it's rather strange that we don't have anybody, when somebody's trying to flatter an individual with brown eyes, when you think of the color brown, what you probably think of is dirt. But it's quite rare for us to say your eyes are brown like dirt, because frankly, dirt is not terribly flattering. It is extremely underwhelming in terms of how much value it would fetch on the market. It is really quite dirt cheap. It is not all that interesting to look at, frankly, unless if you are a geologist, in which case more power to you. Dirt is dirt. Here where I live, it's a little red-orangish because of some iron content in it, but it's not all that interesting. Not as interesting as, say, the bottom of a creek bed, which is a much more poetic way of referring to somebody with brown eyes. That summons imagery of coolness and freshness and life and beauty. Or not as interesting as, I don't know, chocolate. Chocolate is wonderful. I've not had my eyes paralleled to chocolate yet, frankly. Although if somebody would like to, you can feel free to. I think my eyes are more of a greenish brown. They are brown, but more of a greenish brown. So maybe that would be some rather unfortunate chocolate. Personally, I am not a fan of green chocolate. It sounds like there's probably something wrong with it. I would much rather dark chocolate, but I'm afraid my eyes are not dark chocolate color, so I don't think there's much hope for my eyes being compared to chocolate. Rather, I think eyes compared to bronze, eyes compared to the lively wood of the forest might be a little bit more reasonable of a comparison when it comes to somebody who has eyes that are not quite the color of chocolate. But this giant lengthy tangent about eye color is for the sake of saying, essentially, when you use simile, you are bringing more implications behind the simile than just what you were saying. Or when you're more broadly, when you're drawing comparisons. And going beyond simile, when I draw comparisons in poetry, if I were to say a lady's eyes are like the sun at dawn, what is that comparison saying? Well, it's saying her eyes are shining. It's saying her eyes are, what is the sun at dawn? The sun at dawn is a hopeful thing. It's promising of another day. So essentially what I'm saying is that I feel hopeful when I look into her eyes. That's kind of the import of what I'm saying. As opposed if I say her eyes are like the mysterious night sky, that's giving more of a sense that she's probably a character who's a little bit more elusive, mysterious, aloof, uncertain, a little darker perhaps, because the night sky is dark and mysterious, particularly if I'm using the word mysterious. If I say her eyes are like the stars, that seems to imply something fantastical and distant and beyond. If you're one of my fellow medievalists, you might think it sounds kind of angelic, really. So you can do a lot with comparisons and simile that are kind of implied within that comparison or that simile, but aren't explicitly said. So that's where simile can be really helpful to you. Comparison, simile, autonomy, synecdoche, simile. As one last thought before I go on to stricture, if any of you have any good examples of metonymy that you'd like to share with me in your poetry, I'm afraid I feel insufficient in my ability to show a good example or a thorough enough discussion of metonymy. So by all means, please feel free to comment with your own favorite examples of metonymy if you have any. Just please don't. Please be mean. Please don't be mean. I'm sensitive. Don't rail against me for having not being able to come up with a good example of metonymy off the top of my head. It is late. I'm tired. As one last topic before we close today, I guess this isn't really one last topic. I would like to talk a little bit about the structure of your poetry. There's kind of two topics that I really go into is The main thing that I like to talk about is periodic structure, also just general sentence structure as well, which these two are tied together. So when it comes to periodic structure, I think the reason I want to talk about this is because I find myself using periodic sentences all the time, especially in poetry. I use them all the time in poetry. And for those of you who have read my prose, you will find that actually bleeds into my prose quite thoroughly. So a lot of my prose is sometimes a little confusing because the sentences are very long. That's because they are periodic sentences. There are kind of like a bunch of clauses and commas worked into it. What a periodic sentence is, as the name implies, it's a sentence which goes through periods. It doesn't just follow that straight object, verb, direct object structure. If I were to tell you, I love you, that's a very simple sentence. There's nothing periodic about that. If, however, I throw in a who-which clause, and I say, I, who am your greatest admirer, love you, that adds a period-like flow to the sentence. Maybe if I throw a who-which clause all over the place, I say, I, who am your greatest lover, or who am your greatest admirer, love you, who is the furthest from me. That gives a periodic structure to the sentence that makes the sentence a little bit more complicated. You can do a lot with periodic sentences. You can make your poems very interesting with periodic sentences. You can go on some very lengthy tangents with periodic sentences. I might find some examples for you in my own poetry, because frankly I use them all the time, so it would be very easy for me to open up a book and you'll see some. One thing that I think is really neat about periodic sentences is, for me personally, when I first learned about periodic sentences, it actually made me able to appreciate old poetry much better. Because I realized that what they were doing was not just being rambly for rambly's sake. They were actually trying to say things that were quite important and quite powerful. They were saying it in a more convoluted way, but sometimes poetry is more convoluted and it's more beautiful than it is understandable on first read. But once you look past the convolution, you realize what they're doing, you realize that they're saying it quite exquisitely, and what they're saying is quite powerful. And the periodic sentence has a way of giving this sense of journey. If you know that that's what we're doing, if you know we're working through a periodic sentence, then when you come to the end of it, it is all that more of a feeling that you've come to the pinnacle of something. I would like to show you an example of a periodic sentence. This is a poem, which is the entire poem is a periodic sentence. I think it is, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's like 30-something lines of poetry. And I am, again, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it is a whole, the whole thing is one sentence. The whole poem is one sentence. Isn't that quite amazing? 30-something lines, whole poem is one sentence. Each stanza is, of course, divided by colons, but still one sentence. And I would like you to listen to the one sentence, to the whole period, and listen to how that gives you a sense of we're working through something. The thing that might flow through your mind is almost like a montage scene, where it's the music is playing and you're going through all these scenes of one person's life, and then the upshot of it is all at the end. This is the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. And it is really quite amazing how he does this. If you can keep your head when all about you are... Forgive me. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies. Being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build 'em up with worn-out tools. If you can make one heap of your winnings, and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to force your turn long after they are gone, so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch. If neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Feel that. Feel that energy that carries through. You naturally read it more quickly. You're naturally on the edge of your seat as it comes to the end, because you can feel it building to something. If the whole thing is a conditional statement which resolves at one long last. Yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Isn't that amazing? It's like a build-up in music. It's like you can feel in a fugue the first voice sounds, another voice sounds just after, another voice comes into pedal point, you hear the tonic, you hear the dominant. It's starting to, you're starting to hear false entries on the tonic, and you're feeling it, it's gripping you, and then at long last we resolve to the tonic. That's the feeling that this poem gives. You'll see it all the time, these periodic sentences, particularly in older poetry, where people had more patience for longer sentences. An example that comes to my mind might be the end of Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, and thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sickled o'er the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith in moment with disregard their currents turn awry, and to lose the name of action. That is, I believe that is 2 sentences. It may just be 1 sentence, depending on where Shakespeare included colons, or whether he included periods. But if you analyze the sentence, they're grammatically correct. They're just really confusing because nobody talks about native hue of resolution with disregard the currents turn awry. With what regard? It's confusing because that's not how normal people talk. It takes you a moment to read through it and understand what Hamlet is actually saying. But that's part of the beauty to poetry, is that sometimes it takes a moment, like a person. Poetry is something you need to get to know. But once you get to know it, you quite fall in love with it. That may be different between different poems. There are some poems you love instantaneously. When I first read If read to me, I quite liked it. I quite immediately thought it was gripping. But there are some poems that are confusing at first, and those periodic sentences can make things confusing. But when you know what's going on, when you know that that's a periodic sentence that's happening, you're able to hold on to that and come to the resolution and feel the beauty of that. Just like when you listen to a fugue, fugues sound very confusing when you first hear them because it's a lot of voices singing at once and you don't really know what's going on. But once you know what to listen for, it becomes all the more powerful and weighty for you. I could pull out an example of a periodic sentence that I know off the top of my head without even opening up one of these poetry books. Was a poem that I had read previously, which is The Wandering Sheep's Evening Prayer. O thou most gracious shepherd, we both know how much my groaning heart doth ache and tear, to hear thy voice through pastures blow, and look upon the path to see thee there. That's all one sentence. It makes sense. You listen to it, you understand what the words are saying. But there's a lot of whiches and who-which clauses. There's a lot of those kinds of things. There's a lot of ands. And so the sentence is complicated, but it's not completely unknowable. What's fun about periodic sentences is that you can use them in conjunction with shorter sentences. Shorter, more snappy phrases. So we just saw that with the Kipling poem, which is yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. It's all one sentence, but that phrase, you'll be a man, my son, is short and snappy, and it really stands out to you because it's right at the end. When I first had that poem read to me, it was several years afterwards that I came back to it. But that was the phrase that I remembered. You'll be a man, my son, because that was the short and snappy thing at the end of the whole If poem. An example of this from the poem that I just recited might be the second and third stanza, which would be the if just to hear thy voice from through the trees of this confounding bone-hewn path, or confounding bone-hewn forest road, and know my precious Saviour sees the cares and fears which on my shoulders load, I pray let it be so. The third stanza opens up with the I pray let it be so, and that ends the sentence. And that where the sentence ends kind of gives this this sense of a period. But we move on because we haven't ended a line yet. So we move on to vouchsafe thy child, vouchsafe thy treasure, who was worth thy blood, who of thy grace alone is undefiled, vouchsafe me through the fire and through the flood. And the way that the sentence length is varied at the end there adds an intrigue to it. So I would encourage you in your own poetry to use periodic sentences, but perhaps consider as well using them in conjunction with sentences that are shorter to give this sense of something similar to what we had talked about with juxtaposition, where it highlights the distinction between the two of them. The periodic sentences seem more interesting by being more periodic, and the shorter, snappier sentences seem more interesting by being more short and snappy by comparison to each other. So I love periodic sentences. I use them all the time in my poetry. I would encourage you, as you read other poems, to consider what is going on there and you kind of have an attention to the way that the periodic sentence structure is giving this sense of feeling we're climbing a mountain, we're coming to the pinnacle, we've come to the meaning of the sentence at long last. At long last of this long rant, or this long lecture about sentence structure, I'd like to end talking about just kind of how you can, a bit of a footnote on the idea of structure, and we'll go all the way back to the original source that I had in mind, which was St. Anselm's Proslogion. And we'll talk a little bit about just kind of how you can formulate your words, put together your words as building blocks in a structure to give a sense of uniformity to your words. So I will read you a passage from St. Anselm's Proslogion, and what I would like you to listen to in the passage is listen to the way that his repetition has kind of a sense of uniformity to it, and again, hearkening back to the repetition that he utilizes in his writings. Listen to the way that how his repetition adds uniformity. It adds a certain flair and style to his writing, and it adds a certain mood to it that makes it really, it gives it such an amazing character. I beseech you, Lord, let me not sigh in despair, but let me breathe hopefully again. I beseech you, Lord, my heart is made bitter with its desolation. sweeten it with your consolation. I beseech you, Lord, in my hunger I began to seek you. Let me not depart from you empty. I have come to you starving, let me not leave unsatisfied. I have come as a beggar and one who is rich, as a pitiful wretch to one who has pity. Let me not go back penniless and despised. There are two sections here. The first section I would refer to as the I beseech you, Lord section. The second section is I have come, or I began. And the sections are kind of set off by the way that the sentences begin. The first sentence begins, I beseech you, Lord, let me not sigh in despair, but let me breathe the hopefully again. I beseech you, Lord, my heart is made bitter with its desolation. Sweeten it with your consolation. It's almost like a question and answer. Let me not sigh in despair. That's the question. Let me breathe hopefully again. That's the answer. It's set off by the I beseech you, Lord. So there's a very meticulous structure here, and it gives kind of a wonder and a beauty to his words. It also gives, in this case, it gives a sense of desperation, because the repetition of I beseech you, Lord, is drawn out alongside the repetition of those sentence structures. What's interesting about the I beseech you, Lord, is that it overlaps with this kind of other structure, which is very much a mirroring of it. I beseech you, Lord, in my hunger I began to seek you. Let me not depart from you empty. I have come to you starving. Let me not leave unsatisfied. I have come as a beggar to one who is rich, as a pitiful wretch to one who has pity. The second section, I would probably mark off with the I began to seek you. Let me not depart from you empty. I have come to you starving. Let me not leave unsatisfied. I have come as a beggar to one who is rich, as a pitiful wretch to one who has pity. The thing that you hear emphasized throughout that passage is the I have come, or I began. Again, it's similarly, it's a call and response, a question and an answer. I have come as this, let me not leave empty. I have come as a beggar, let me not leave deprived, or whatever. What's interesting with this passage is that what you might be able to see formulating is a little bit of a rule of threes here. In general, when it comes to writing, when you do things like periodic sentences in groups of three, that actually helps the reader sort of understand what you're doing. 2 sentences is enough to establish a pattern, and then 3 is enough to either continue that pattern or to subvert expectations by breaking that pattern. And if you read through, I do this almost subconsciously by this point in my own writing. I'm sure you can find it in other people's writings too. Even just when people list off things, you'll find that it can often be in groups of 3. And that's because listing off things, again, 2 is enough to establish a pattern in one way. So if I talk to you about Father and Son, the pattern you'll establish, there are a few different patterns you can establish. You can say the pattern between the 2 of those is familial. The pattern between the 2 of these is personal. Father and Son are both persons. The pattern you can see between the 2 of these is relational. They're people who relate to each other. The pattern you can see between the 2 of these is masculine. They're both men, Father and Son. When I say Father, Son, Spirit, that highlights a certain pattern among the 3 of them, which is that of personhood. Father, Son, and Spirit are all persons. This is very fascinating. You could draw other parallels to them as well. I wouldn't say that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the Trinity specifically are not familial as opposed to being personal. I think they can be. The Trinity is a multifaceted reality. I'm using that as an exemplary case. But in general, when it comes to drawing, to using the rule of threes, that's a really genius way of having a grouping that is related, having a grouping that kind of establishes that pattern. You can either break that pattern or you can continue that pattern. it adds a certain style to your writing and a certain symmetry. It feels right to the reader. And again, by this point, I do it subconsciously. So I would suggest you play with that if you're new to writing. If you're listing off things, doing them in groups of 3. Moving on in Anselm's Proslogion. I would also like to draw your attention to this passage here, where he also utilizes sentence structure. So what you'll see here is this is further on in his prayer. The sentence structure that he has is kind of like a statement A, and then a statement B, and then what you see is a statement B, statement A. That's kind of like the call and response. Teach me how to seek you, and show yourself to me when I seek. I cannot seek you unless you teach me how, and I cannot find you unless you show yourself to me. Let me seek you. Oh, I think I found the wrong passage. Forgive me. Chiasm is what we call this. I do love being you. Okay, it's just a little further on. I cannot find you unless you show me yourself to me. Let me seek you in desiring you. Let me desire you in seeking you. Let me find you in loving you. Let me love you in finding you. Do you hear that? So the statement A, let me seek you in desiring you. Let me desire you in seeking you. Statement A, let me seek you. Statement B, in desiring you. Let me desire you. Statement A. Statement B, in seeking you. Statement A. The chiasm there is really, really ingenious. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is a little tangential note. I believe this prayer specifically is in the 2019 Book of Common Prayer, so that's pretty cool. But I'll restart the prayer from the beginning because I had a little bit of confusion. I stumbled in the middle. But listen to the prayer and listen to the way that chiasm has this particular, again, I'm not really sure if I can describe it as anything but a particular beauty to it. It adds a particular style to his words, and a particular wonder to his words, and almost kind of, in this case, a particular feeling of summativeness to everything. We're starting on one end of the rope and we're going to the other end, and we're starting on the other end of the rope and we're going to the other end. We're saying to the whole thing, let me seek you, let me desire you. Teach me how to seek you, and show yourself to me when I seek. For I cannot seek you unless you teach me how, and I cannot find you unless you show yourself to me. Let me seek you in desiring you. Let me desire you in seeking you. Let me find you in loving you. Let me love you in finding you. And that's... The poem has a particular beauty for that reason. It's so summative. It says so much by this chiasm, by this A, B, B, A statement. And in the usual way of poetry, it says one thing that opens up to so much more, which is just really wonderful. Anselm is, you'll find, just has an amazing way with words. Again, because each word was chosen very intentionally. It's no wonder that his prayer made his way into the 2019 prayer book. I'm quite sure. So all this come kind of to the end of everything that I'd like to talk about. Come to the end of all the literary devices that I'd like to talk about. All of the different tools in the toolbox, so to speak. And fortunately, I've not fallen asleep in the middle of my discussion. I'm actually not quite sure how long this video actually is. I've mostly sat in my chair talking for a while, but based on how much I can feel my system crashing and shutting down, I'm sure I've been here for quite some time. At the end of this video, I would like to talk, maybe just quickly, a little bit about just kind of a few fun little tangential thoughts on poetry. or just a few like last little things to get your mind flowing with ideas for what you can do with little words specifically. So one thing that I like using a lot is what's called alliteration. Alliteration is very simple. It's very straightforward, and you can use it pretty much any time. It is when you start two or more words with the same letter. You'll see it all the time in sermons. Preachers, for some reason, love using alliteration. You'll see it a lot in poetry for sure. And there are ways you can utilize alliteration to different effects. I particularly enjoy alliteration for comedic effect. So if you read my story that I recently read, The Inventor's Heptilemma, you'll see that there's quite a bit of alliteration. Even the main character's name, Felix Faulkner, is an alliteration on the letter F. Both the first name and the last name start with the letter F. Alliteration gives something actually kind of like a particular ring to it. So we all know the phrase "curiosity killed the cat." That's because all words in the phrase start with "k." Originally, neat note about that is that catchphrase was actually invented by Shakespeare, if I'm not mistaken. It was originally "care killed the cat." If all this is, of course, if Mark Forsyth is correct about his history, he's my source. Originally, it was "care killed the cat." To Shakespeare, care meant like causing really so tearing yourself up over somebody, so to speak. So you cared to the cat too much and you killed it. But now it's become "curiosity killed the cat" because the word "care" has changed in meaning, and original phrasing doesn't make as much sense to us anymore. Fun little note about that. But it still starts with a K sound, because that K sound has a nice ring to it. The "curiosity killed the cat." We like the alliteration. It feels right to us. A lot of names stick with us when there are alliterations. In fact, if you look down and you see the two YouTube channels I have recommended for you, the two YouTube channels are Anglican Aesthetics and the Anglican Acolyte. What's interesting about those two channels is that both of their names are alliterations on the letter A. That's what makes their channel names so genius, because they're two words, but being an alliteration, they stick with you. Anglican Aesthetics and Anglican Acolyte. So, kudos to them for having a name that's an alliteration. I'm afraid my name is not an alliteration. My name is just JT Basener. It's just my name. Yeah, so that's not so interesting, I'm afraid. But you can use it. I use it for comedic effect sometimes. If you read The Inventor's Heptilemma, you get a lot of passages like Felix was a lumbering bombard of bombastic blastings or something like that, and you get an alliteration of the letter B. You get fun little alliterations like that, which can give that comedic effect. I would caution sometimes maybe the comedic effects can be a little too intense when you don't want it to be. Other times, though, alliteration can be used to give kind of like an effect of power to something. I had a poem that was like, "Oh, fearsome thrashing fires," and the way that the alliteration on the F's and the THs happened, it gave this kind of similar to the effect of repetition. It gives this sense of waves beating against you. And one last note, I would like to talk a little bit about wordplay. Poetry is the time to have fun with puns. You can use wordplay. You can use words that have multiple meanings. In fact, in my poem "To a Dead Deer," if you noticed while I was reading it, I said, "Oh dear, dear friend." And if you were to look at the words as I was reading them, and you somehow were given the superhuman ability of understanding my handwriting, you would see that "oh dear, dear friend" is spelled differently the two times. The first "dear" being dear as in dear to me, and the second "dear" being dear as in the thing with antlers that runs through the woods. And that is a play on words. In this poem, it's a little too solemn to be considered a pun, but it's definitely a good example of play on words. People who know me will testify to you that I use puns all the time, and I make dad jokes to the extent that make people want to strangle me. They don't end up strangling me because I guess I have enough good poetry and I'm also a brilliant swordsman. But the reason I make dad jokes all the time is because as a poet, I like words that have double meanings. I like words that are you can play with, because that's what we do as poets. We play with words. Um, we are taking up things. We are taking up everyday things, and we're consecrating them to sacred purposes, such as playing. Now, all this at the end comes to the end of all the kind of literary devices I wanted to talk about. And so I guess now what I would like to speak to is sort of the summative purpose of this whole series has been to say why poetry is important. And I hope kind of what maybe your eyes are open to is the fact that when we understand the devices of poetry, such as analogy, we develop a certain way of looking at the world that allows us to see the relationship among things and to learn from different things in by means of analogy. So we have certain life experiences, and that teaches us something about the broader reality. You can come across a dead deer in a garden, and you can see your own life experiences in that with a poetic mindset. It's a type of mindset that is not popular to us in the modern day. In our modern day, we like everything to be analytical and to be one-to-one characterizations. But with a poetic mindset, you get a lot more meaning out of the world just by understanding the relationship among things. I would like to close with this thought, is that this is perhaps an admonition for my viewers to consider the idea of all of reality as a whole. For me as a theist, I am quite convinced that reality is created much in the same way that I create a poem or I create a piece of music. And I think there's very good reason for that. And one of the reasons I would consider is the fact that reality is very interrelated, just like a poem. In a poem, you draw analogies. In a poem, you have symmetries. And in the same way, in reality, you have symmetries in nature. You have symmetries between the way the natural world experiences things, the way the natural world experiences cycles, the natural world experiences life, death, and resurrection. That's very much analogous to what we as humans experience and what we as humans long for, what we as humans express our longings for in epics, in stories, in myths and legends. It's very much seems to imply that as we have an understanding of a certain structure to reality and to certain parts of reality, it really does make one wonder, does this structure apply to all of reality? And I would say just the common sensible answer is yes, the structure does apply to all of reality. The structure we see of death and resurrection, of going into the pit and rising out, is very much summative of the world, really. Um, and that is a conclusion that I just think a common sense interpretation of the facts. There's it would be rather strange for the whole world to seem to be hearkening to a certain idea, and that certain idea to just be complete hogwash. C.S. Lewis, as usual, puts it quite well. in his book, The Grand Miracle, he talks about how if we had a symphony, but we didn't have the original main theme of the symphony, um, we would be able, if we were given that main theme of the symphony, we would be able to see how it fits in perfectly and how all of the developments on that main theme are valid and beautiful developments of what was originally brought in. And that if somebody were to try and bring in something that isn't the main theme of the symphony, it would quite clearly become obvious that that's not the main theme of the symphony. In the same way, I would see creation and the world, the life, death, and resurrection of the world to be a symphony, which demands a main theme. And as a point in favor of the Christian understanding of the world, the Christian understanding of God is that God goes through life, death, and resurrection so that we ourselves can go through life, death, and resurrection. Which, if you think about the way that nature is ordered, you think about the way that the stars are ordered, the seasons are ordered, that everything seems to revolve, and that our simple longings in our hearts seem to be developed. It does seem to feel, the more you think about it, I am quite convinced the more it seems to be a missing theme of the symphony of life. It's like, as Chesterton talks about, the gears of the machine clicking in place. It makes us realize why we should be so satisfied with something ending and yet so dissatisfied with passing on. We want things to be resurrected. That's what we long for. We yearn for resurrection. St. Paul talks about how creation groans with birth pains. We yearn for that. And I would admonish you to consider the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus because it is so satisfactory to those yearnings. And with a poetic mindset on the world, drawing this all back to poetry, with this understanding that God is a poet, that the world is a poem, that creation is a metaphor of reality itself. It makes a lot of sense that the way that ultimate reality would be ordered would be something of a theme, the culmination of the theme of all of our immediate reality experiences. That it would be something of the thesis statement at the end of the essay, the theme within the fugue, the couplet at the end of the sonnet. And so as you walk away and write your own poetry and read your own poetry, I would admonish you to consider that. Consider that within reality. Consider that as you reflect upon these things. And I would admonish you also to try and adopt the mind of a poet. Adopt the ability to see things and see the way that things relate to each other and the way that things relate to ultimate reality in a fantastical and a really kind of wonderful and enchanting way. I, for one, have quite experienced it to be wonderful, and I will have you know that that type of rush of watching the world come to life, watching the world, the interrelations of reality come to life, is something that, quite frankly, will never grow old. Will always be new, will always be fresh, will always be wonderful for you. And so I wish you well on your writing your poetry, and I send you the best of wishes in this time to come. And I hope that on the night that after you watch this, you're going to get better sleep than I'm probably going to get. And my best of blessings go out to all of you, my friends.